Thanks so much, and it's great to be with all of you to talk about a very important topic, U.S. regulatory considerations for cellular agriculture. And today we're not just going to focus on cell-based meat, but we'll also think about cow-free dairy, the various products like milk and cheese produced without the animal as well. So as we have been hearing throughout the conference, the drivers of the technology in this space really tied to the increasing global population and the need to leverage and harness the best of science and technology. And to do so, we also need a regulatory framework that promotes innovation. Here in the United States and around the world, there's been lots of questions around the regulatory conversation that has been emerging. What is meat anyway? Lab-grown food sets off a debate. Lab-grown meat raises regulatory questions. Real cheese without the cow. People are really curious about this technology, and the regulators have taken notice, and big food companies, big household brands that we're familiar with are also really interested in this technology. There's a bit of suspicion in new technologies like cellular agriculture, but there's also a lot of fascination with it. So let's just dive right in, cut to the chase, and talk about the regulatory framework here in the United States. So FDA is a key regulator of most foods here in the US. They have broad authority to regulate foods. The FDA determines safety of new food ingredients, including those used in plant-based foods, seafood, and the ingredients used in meat and poultry products. FDA regulates food products of biotechnology, and regulates microbial, algal, and fungal cells generated from large-scale culture and used as direct food ingredients. And as we know, FDA has a long-standing history of regulating animal cell culture technology in the therapeutic settings, which could be really useful for understanding how that technology should be regulated for food production purposes. So when it comes to cow-free dairy regulatory pathways, like cheeses and milks and other products like that, the considerations are really broken out into these three main categories: pre-market safety, manufacturing, and labeling. So when it comes to pre-market safety, it's fair to conclude that the substances used in the manufacturing process will definitely be evaluated. So here, we're concerned with inputs like the processing aids, the strain of the yeast, a modification of that yeast and its output. FDA will be looking to see whether the identity has remained the same. What's the history of safe use for the substances, and is there common knowledge of safety? And what about the margin of exposure? When you put all of this together, it sounds a lot like the food additive or the GRAS pathway here in the United States, and we know that companies like Perfect Day have taken advantage of the GRAS pathway, for example, and GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe. We can have an entire 1 or 2 hour discussion on that topic, but suffice it to say that it's a unique pathway available in the United States for novel ingredients for addition to food. And it's the preferred pathway because you can do a self-assessment and you can send that assessment voluntarily into the FDA for them to basically issue a response saying that they have no objections to your determination of safety, or to ask you questions to get you to a favorable outcome for your new food ingredient. So in addition to pre-market safety considerations, there's the manufacturing process. So with respect to the manufacturing process, FDA is focused on whether the process produces a product that is substantially different from its conventional counterparts in any key respects. Are there any concerns about purity, toxicity, or safety? And if so, are these unique hazards that require certain unique control measures? In other words, we need to apply FDA's preventive controls approach, which is codified in the FDA regulations. This is the current framework that we use today to currently control risks by identifying hazards and controls. And so this existing regulatory framework can be applied, and it is being applied to cellular agriculture, to novel ways of producing food products. So when it comes to labeling, which we'll get into later on in the presentation in a couple of minutes, FDA is very cognizant of the debate that has been ongoing in the United States regarding plant-based foods, for example, and that has kind of trickled over to the cell-based meat products. And then there's been questions raised regarding flora-based products, cow-free dairy, and whether or not they qualify for the standards of identity that are codified in FDA regulations for milk, for instance, or cheese, and so forth. So turning over to cell-based meat, we have a memorandum of understanding that is in place that was issued back in March of 2019, and it outlines how the two regulators of food in the United States, the FDA and USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, will work together. So as brief background for anyone that's not too familiar with how the US works in terms of food regulation, FDA is definitely the key food regulator here in the United States, but the USDA is charged with oversight for meat, poultry, and certain other products like catfish and certain egg products as well. So in the case of cell-based meat products and poultry products, the FDA and the USDA will have to come together to oversee the production process. So FDA will be exercising regulatory oversight up until the point of harvest from the bioreactor. At that point, USDA will take over oversight, and they will be in charge of inspection and labeling oversight. So in that memorandum of understanding that was issued back in March of 2019, they left open the possibility that there could be rulemaking from the FDA or USDA. We now know from a recent announcement at the end of July that USDA will actually be going ahead with rulemaking for developing new regulatory requirements for a labeling of cell-based meat and poultry products falling under their jurisdiction. So that's definitely an area to keep an eye out for. Any stakeholders in this space, in the cell-based meat poultry space, should definitely be paying attention, and there will be opportunities for submitting comments whenever the USDA gets around to issuing a proposed rule. And to the extent that there are coalitions and interested parties that want to have a say in what the labeling rules look like, they should be engaging with the agency. The good news about the Memorandum of Understanding is that it does build on existing precedents in American food law. So we already went over basically what FDA oversees. It builds on that, but it also builds on what USDA oversees currently. So today, as we speak, law in the United States says that the USDA regulates meat and meat products, poultry and poultry products under two key statutes, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. They regulate processing, and they work together with the FDA on establishing safety and suitability of various foods, various meat and poultry products. It's important to note that as of last summer, the FDA and USDA have created working groups, interagency working groups, to work through a lot of the details of fleshing out the Memorandum of Understanding. So for starters, we have the Pre-Market Safety Group, which is focused on essentially FDA oversight and what companies will need to bring to bear in terms of data, et cetera, to successfully introduce their products to the marketplace. There's also one interagency working group focused on the transfer of jurisdiction. So as we discussed, when you're making a meat or poultry product from cell culture technology, it's going to involve both the FDA and the USDA. So how we transition from the FDA at that one plant to the USDA at that plant is a very tricky area, and the regulators themselves need to figure out the details. And so they have an entire working group dedicated to that topic. What is the smooth, efficient transition of jurisdiction from the FDA to the USDA? And then we have labeling. As I stated, we now know that USDA will be producing a proposed rule at some point in the future for cell-based meat products. And the FDA will definitely have a seat at the table so that the principles on labeling are aligned. We're not aware that the FDA will actually be doing any rulemaking themselves on labeling. It's just the USDA at this point. But the point is that we need both of the agencies to be together One of the main reasons for that is that for all other products produced through cell culture technology, like seafood, that's all pretty much FDA. And then obviously other products of cellular agriculture would be regulated by FDA. It's only the meat and poultry products that are regulated by the USDA. So in terms of the regulatory pathway for cell-based meat, the considerations are essentially the same. We have pre-market safety, manufacturing process considerations, labeling, and what will the facility inspection look like. In terms of pre-market safety, some questions that come to mind. We're looking really at the cell growth, the cells, the growth media, the growth factors, scaffold, the finished products. I think FDA will also be focused on whether any of the inputs are the subject of investigational new drug applications, and whether we've considered if the input is also permissible for use in food production, and on what basis. And what about the use of human recombinant proteins, which is a very common question that has arisen in the past at various conferences like this one. How are we planning to establish safety? What's the residual exposure level? And have we considered allergenic or autoimmune responses, for example? On the labeling front, we'll get into that in a second. And then, of course, there's the facility inspection questions. There's safety considerations and potential hazards. This chart right here is taken from an FDA guidance and applies to food production generally. I think the take-home message here is that we want to leverage best practices from traditional food production and consider how the products that we're producing will compare to traditionally produced dairy products from a compositional, nutritional, and organoleptic standpoint. I'm going to skip over these two slides, but I'm sure they'll be available to you online. FDA and USDA have very unique requirements when it comes to imports, and you need to meet a lot of the same legal requirements as domestically produced foods, and then there's additional requirements on top of that, both of the FDA and USDA oversight when it comes to FDA and USDA oversight. In terms of labeling developments, there's been a lot happening here in the United States. We had the bioengineered food disclosure final rule, which takes effect in terms of compliance as of January 1st, 2022. We have FDA actively considering modernizing food standards of identity. And we have FDA actively considering the use of the names of dairy foods in the labeling of plant-based food products. And when it comes to cow-free dairy, for example, produced through cell culture technology, the question is, do flora-based dairy products like these qualify as milk products under current standards of identity? We have laws that are being passed at the state level in the United States that are trying to restrict the ways in which dairy terms are used, and we need to keep an eye out for those because we don't want to have producers of dairy products through cell culture technology being limited in the types of nomenclature and names that they can use for their products, as long as they're truthful and not misleading. When it comes to meat products and the labeling for cell-based meat, there's no set nomenclature. We have a petition filed by the U.S. Cattlemen's Association that's trying to limit the definition of beef to product from cattle born, raised, and harvested in the traditional manner. There's been a lot of state activity in this regard as well. Take a look at this activity from 2019, where states are pretty much proposing rules along the lines of what that petition was asking for. And here are examples from Missouri and Oklahoma of state laws. The good news for meat and poultry products is that USDA will be taking the lead on labeling, and once USDA has rules in place, those rules based on existing law would trump any of the state regulations when it comes to cell-based meat labeling. As I stated, there is rulemaking on the horizon when it comes to cell-based meat and poultry products. USDA has a number of standards of identity on the books for meat and poultry. And the question is whether those standards of identity, like this one for hamburger, would be considered as appropriate for cell-based beef products that are actually being made into hamburgers. These are a lot of intricate questions there. Of course, labeling has a huge role to play when it comes to consumer perception, as that is the first way in which your products are introduced to consumers. It's the first way that they interact with them. And so the labeling debate at the state level of all those state bills that we just went over or saw in that previous slide will certainly impact the discussion at the federal level. There's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different viewpoints that are being voiced. Looking ahead, I think we can look for further clarification from the FDA and USDA regarding the regulatory framework for cell-based meat, really fleshing out the details of what the regulatory pathway will look like. We now know that we have labeling rules coming on stream for cell-based meat and poultry products, and we can probably look out for potential pronouncements from FDA on labeling of flora-based cow-free dairy products. Whether or not the existing standards of identity are appropriate, or whether we need voluntary disclosures, disclaimers around basically, how these products are made. And I'm sure there'll be continued political interest in legislation, both at the federal and state level. I have a couple articles that have been published focused on the cell-based meat side of things, and in particular, this producing food products from cultured animal tissues from April, where I co-authored a paper, peer-reviewed paper with meat scientists. It's a very good synergy of the technical considerations, and the regulatory and policy considerations. So have a look at that. I'm available on Twitter at food_attorney. I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also call or email me. I will take any questions if we have time for them, and if not, please feel free to follow up with me.